Hi, and welcome to a special episode of Online Education Across the Atlantic. And today, for the first time, we're actually doing an interview-based podcast. And the opportunity we have is the fact that Rajay Naik has had a lot of experience both in the UK and the US and other locations dealing with online education. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to get somebody else's perspective on the compare and contrast where online education is going in these different regions. So what we're going to do, we're going to share the interview with you, and then we're going to come back and have a conversation about what we heard. So I hope you enjoyed the interview. So we here at Online Education Across the Atlantic, we don't do interviews. That's not what this is not an interview-based podcast, but there's always time for exceptions. And one of the exceptions makes sense right now for two main reasons. One is the fact that this is the godfather of the podcast. You've actually introduced me to Neil several years ago, so we can actually say you're the executive producer of this podcast. So I appreciate that connection.
I think I've ever had, Phil. I love it.
Yeah. So it's a great connection, and you are a very good connector. But the second reason is that we are exploring the whole idea of online education and how it differs. So between the US and between the UK, and how do you understand those markets and other international issues? And you've got a very unique background in this area. So why don't we start off? Could you just do a quick, introduce yourself, but if you could sort of describe for our viewers and listeners, like where you've worked so that they can have a better idea of what you've seen in online education from different views.
Thank you, Phil. And honestly, you, Morgan, Neil, some of the best people I know, and I love the way you shine a light on our whole industry, on the whole space, and it's always a pleasure to speak. So the 2 minutes, Phil, is that I started off life in a wonderful city called Coventry, thought that government was a place to change the world, was extraordinarily lucky in coming from quite a challenging upbringing, amazing parents and amazing love, but in terms of socioeconomic groupings and all of that, it was tough. And but I had amazing opportunities in government, was in local government and then in central government. And at the time, I was very, very lucky because I'd been doing a lot in education. I'd written and co-authored quite a bit. I'd done a few boards fairly early on in my career. And then the Prime Minister of the time, Gordon Brown, asked me to do this big review of higher education. This was in 2009. He and David Cameron, who was then leader of the opposition, set it up, Gordon Brown and David Cameron. And so was on the review and then fell in love with higher education. Got to know the system very well and went to the Open University initially for a short time. I was there for 6 months. And Martin Bean, who many people listening to this will know, kind of was just the most amazing leader. And I just fell for this guy completely. It was just like, I need to spend more time here. And was there for 5 years and, was, kind of involved in really driving the next chapter in the OU story and particularly running the external aspects of the organization. And we had an amazing 5 years. During that time, we established FutureLearn. Many people will know FutureLearn, but was essentially a MOOC platform, a response to what we saw going on with Coursera and edX. And we had a good first few years, but what all the presidents and vice chancellors were saying to me was, look, Rajay, we need real degree programs, real students, real revenue, where's the business model? And so OPM had kicked off. I was very close to joining 2U with Chip at that point, very close to joining Randy Best, but went with Sterling Partners and we built out Keypath and had the great privilege of being chief exec for our kind of bit of the business. And we ran the online degrees for great international universities. Some big
and which part of the part of the business you're talking about with Keypath is specifically international, but define what that meant so we can get a better idea.
Essentially, the European markets primarily, Phil, is what I was primarily focused on. Now, there was a lot of movement between the the UK and Australia, as you know, right? So revolving door. So Martin Bean from the OU went on to run RMIT, and that was very helpful. Obviously, when we were trying to do that deal, UNSW, Exeter, Aston, all of that, and we had an amazing 5 years. It was a time when you were still having to define what this kind of OPM thing was. You were having to kind of, people would fall off their chair when you would say, you're going to run their online degrees for 10 years, you're going to do a rev share deal, you're going to run marketing and recruitment and student support and all the rest of it on their behalf. But over time, people increasingly saw the benefits of doing it. They saw the need to move online. They saw that there was a capability set that they didn't have internally. But I also, towards the end of my time, this was just before the pandemic, began to also realize how that model needed to evolve, and how if we didn't begin to evolve it, then we were going to be in trouble. Because universities increasingly thought, what, I want more of this, I want less of that, I want a slightly different business model, I want whatever. And so evolving that we thought was important, which is why we then created Skilled. But yeah, feel really privileged to do something that is both hugely transformational, in terms of the lives of thousands of people around the world, millions of people around the world, but still really intellectually stimulating, really challenging, new kind of things to get stuck into every day. And
So tell us a little bit about Skilled education. And well, tell us about that, but where the focus is, because it also appears to me like there's been somewhat of a shift in the past year or two on how broad your scope is. So tell me about Skilled.
Yeah, so Skilled essentially came about in 2020, and it was a response to what we saw going on, which was people being too rigid with the model, essentially. If you were just doing 10-year rev share, and these are the responsibilities, these are the programs, this is the split, that's too restrictive. We need to begin to evolve that. And that's what we wanted to do. And so we completely unbundled the proposition. And that enabled us to partner with some of the best universities in the world, firstly. So our first partner was the University of Cambridge. Our second partner was the London School of Economics, and so on. But it essentially meant that whether you want learning design, marketing and recruitment, student support, admissions we increasingly do, tutoring we increasingly do, we could provide that choice to the university. And in addition to that, we could offer revenue share and fee for service. And so essentially the university gets a lot of control and choice, but you also get a partner that is only doing online, right? That is only focused on growing, particularly post-grad, kind of international enrollments to these degree programs. But also in addition to that, you see an increasing number of universities moving in-house. They're growing their in-house division, or they're growing with an OPM, but we can provide that kind of international engine for them. And so, yeah, you're right, Phil. I mean, we have obviously grown quite significantly, and we've now also expanded into the US, where US partners are coming to us and saying, look, we really want to grow internationally. We really want to grow our online enrollments amongst students across the planet. Can you help us with that? And because we're unbundled, because we can kind of be quite aligned with our partners, we're having great success doing that.
So tell me about the international student angle, and then let's get into our broader conversation. Do you only, are you limited to international student recruitment for online programs, or is it you're limited to programs that include international enrollment? Like, how tied are you to that angle?
Great question. More of the latter than the former. So what we always say when we go into institutions is we want programs that are going to be highly successful globally. And so that means that, for example, a lot of the US nursing programs don't really work internationally, right? They are really focused on a domestic audience. And by the way, there's a massive demand for them, right? So keep doing that domestically. But if you are skilled to grow that program internationally, we will be very straightforward and say that's not going to work, because that's not what the global market is looking for. But what the global market is looking for is increasingly, we're finding, we want to study with a great university in the US or UK. I want to study with a big brand that is admired around the world. By the way, that doesn't need to be the Harvard, Yale, Stanford kind of badge. It can just be that I want to study with the US or UK university, right? And actually, in a large number of cases, that's what it is. And they want to study the programs Phil, right? They want to do business programs, they want to do computing programs, they want to do engineering programs. and they want to do healthcare programs. And then increasingly, we're encouraging our partners to do interdisciplinary programs where you combine, one of our biggest programs right now is the MBA with AI. Um, there's stuff
Naturally.
that is just extraordinary demand. And, so we bring the data, we bring the insights. Most of our senior team have been doing this in one way, shape, or form for 15, 20 years, from Laureate and HEP and various other companies in this space. And we will say very, very clearly, these are the programs that are going to work. And sometimes the universities say, look, strategically, we just need to do this because this faculty member has got a real desire and passion and
Yeah.
whatever. And we will say, look, okay, let's do that within a balanced portfolio. Let's do that where we can build out some suites that are related. Let's do that where we know we're going to be successful. And that's what's enabled us to get 100% partner satisfaction so far, 5 years in.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you. So a variety of perspectives, which is what I like. You've seen it from an institution, although a unique institution with Open University. And by the way, Martin's going to be in Leeds. I'm just thinking maybe he should be my second interview
Yeah.
for the podcast. But in any case, the broader topic is sort of understanding different online markets. And in the US, I've described to people that, if you go back to the 2000s, the for-profits, the continuing education departments, and there was an OPM market already, but a lot of times it was regional schools, nursing, so stuff sort of over to the side.
Yeah.
It really changed in the US, in my perspective, with the introduction of MOOCs and the introduction of 2U, because what that sort of signaled to the market was everybody, including elite universities, should think about what is our online strategy. So the change wasn't the MOOC. The change was that Harvard and MIT started edX and, that kind of thing. Stanford started Udacity and Coursera. And then with 2U marketing to elite programs, and there were other factors, but online education in the U.S. really took off for nonprofit universities in the 2010s, at the same time that for-profits were decreasing in enrollment. And so the market really exploded, but then now it's a very crowded market because all these schools have programs, so the dynamics have changed. The UK has been quite different. It seemed like outside of Open University, there wasn't much online in the early 2010s. So help me understand sort of that type of narrative of UK online education, where it really, what were the big markers of its changes?
Your analysis is spot on, by the way, Phil. It is really interesting. When I arrived at the OU, there was just about no one doing online beyond our institution. Edinburgh had a little bit of activity. Coventry were talking about doing something. The one that was really the standout was Liverpool. Liverpool had a very long-standing relationship with Laureate that kicked off back in 2006, 2007. And Liverpool had built a really commanding position in that space. Actually, some of our senior team had launched that back then. And what you found was that it was really isolated. It was a little cottage industry inside universities sometimes. There was one or two programs online, but they hadn't done the hard work. They hadn't shifted their programs, their systems, their IT, their intakes, their fees, their everything else to really suit online. That began to change when you had an increasing number of OPMs coming into the UK. Keypath was obviously one of them. 2U was another. Wiley obviously had their business. Pearson had their business. And so as people began to become more informed, frankly, the US narrative really helped as well because you had big institutions that you could point to that you could tell the story with. That did begin to evolve. I think there was a whole range of reasons why it didn't take off in the way that it should have done, though, during that.
And this period you're talking about, particularly of OPMs coming into UK, is the first half of the 2010s, 2011 through 15?
No, I mean, FutureLearn, we kicked off in 2012, which was helpful.
Yeah.
But people thought that could be their online story. And that's not an online story. Doing a MOOC is not an online story. And so it was really, I think, the latter half of the 2010s, Phil. It was 2014 through to 2020 we really got Keypath going in 2015. Uh, Pearson were really beginning to evolve then. The Deltac deal had been done. That was when you saw people like Birmingham, people like Aston, a bunch of others, beginning to grow postgrad online. But it really didn't take off, I don't think, until much, much, much more recently. And I think, frankly, there's been complicated stories amongst the providers and the partners in this space. I think that there's been a feeling sometimes that do I need to do this? Whereas now increasingly, I think the demand side is saying to these universities, you need to do this, and we need you to provide great postgrad online. And that's why in the UK you're seeing an increasing number of formal processes going on, either via an RFP or via
So it's later, but let me ask you an interesting timing question, or it's interesting to me, but I don't know if they're related. In the LMS market, in the early 2010s, it had to be on-premise type of hosting, particularly in UK and throughout Europe. And a lot of that was data privacy concerns, and the concept of putting academic information in the cloud was just an anathema. And that really seemed to change. The trigger in the LMS market was Birmingham moving to Canvas. I think that was in 2015,
yeah,
roughly, which is interesting timing because you're saying that's right around the time frame that the OPM. So it seemed like there was some inflection point,
that was.
not just in terms of purely online, but sort of the online digital education concept. Is there a correlation there?
There's definitely a correlation. There's definitely a correlation. If you think about it from the perspective of university, right? And you're absolutely right. It was a real privilege to sit around the table at the OU, and that's helped me, over the last 10 years as I've thought about partnerships in this space. You've got anywhere between 5 and 10 really serious, big strategic priorities you're driving through your organization that are consuming every single day, right? Every single committee, council, board, all of that is really focused on those big 5 to 10 kind of drivers. You've then got at least 5 to 10 emergencies that you're dealing with at any one time, on top of that. And so, I totally get it. Like when I'm talking to the provost that I was just talking to at an amazing US university before this, she's saying to me, I really want to do this, and she's spending a huge amount of time on it, but there's a lot of stuff going on. And so unless it becomes a priority, unless the president and the provost say, look, this is really important because this is where we need to be by 2030, 2035, it doesn't happen. And that's where I think it relates to the wider digital infrastructure of the university. It's an increasing number of universities saying, you know what, and COVID, by the way, I think is a massive red herring in all of this. I don't think COVID particularly helped us in any way, shape, or form. I think arguably it got in the way, and it meant that people had a bad perception about online learning and things like that. But I think increasingly students are expecting a different type of provision on campus. That has led to a realization that they need to shift the LMS infrastructure, the SITs and the student registration systems, the fees portals, the CRMs, all of that sort of stuff on campus. And it's increasingly meant that they realize also that, we can move into this digital online innovation realm, and this can really, really, really help us. Where I do encourage universities to be cautious, though, is to say, don't set this up in isolation. Don't put this on the side of the institution in some other box, because A, it's going to be inefficient, and B, you're not going to get the benefits from it. Actually see it as a core part of your teaching and learning strategy. See it as a core part of your internationalization strategy. See it as a core part of your financial strategy. And that's how you're going to get the best returns. That's how you're going to.
Isn't there, I can see that argument long term, but isn't there an argument saying, but a lot of universities need a skunk works approach. They need the ability. And I guess for listeners that are not of the proper age, skunk works was created by Lockheed, and they're the 50s, 60s. And the idea was for this type of long range work that at the time led to the U-2 aircraft and some really innovative stuff, we have to create a separate organization that doesn't have our bureaucracy and mindsets, and you're not fighting, and you can establish something and then you can integrate it back in. So I guess my question to you is, isn't there a risk of trying to from day one put it into the mainstream of the university that you then set yourself up against bureaucracy and perceived assumptions that make it slower?
It's a great it's a great question, Phil. And what I would say there is even Lockheed Martin would come back and say at some point you need to
Yes.
have a view to where it's going to get to. And I absolutely am with you in validation processes. These programs need to be a slightly different muscle because otherwise it's going to take 4 years. The ability to sign stuff off needs to move quickly because we want to get into market swiftly. The ability to ensure that we can get accreditation and some of those sorts of things needs to move more quickly. And so, why do they ever partner with us? Right? Is kind of the question that we're also kind of getting to here because why wouldn't universities just do this in house? And I think sometimes we thought about capital as being the big driver for this. I've always thought actually it's more about expertise and bandwidth. That expertise and bandwidth, A, to just have the space in the day to do it well, but B, the expertise to really get the learnings from student success and the student experience guys right the way through back to the learning design guys and the marketing guys and the
So
recruitment.
the so the
That
skunk works in this case is your partnership with an OPM company. That is your skunk works. Let us move things quicker and not be with your past assumptions, but from day one with the idea that over time we've got to get this back into the main part of the university.
Absolutely right. And it has to have the legitimacy and the buy-in and the blessing of the people right at the very top. And the best examples of this I've seen are where it reports into the provost or someone right at the top of the organization, but they allow us the space to move quickly. And I always say, don't ask academics to be involved if they're really reluctant and that kind of stuff, right? Move quickly, go with the people that want to be involved. And as I heard in a meeting yesterday, everyone then wants to jump in because in 6 months' time, they see that it's successful, they see that it's going really, really well, they see great retention and great student satisfaction, and they say, I want a bit of that too. So I think making sure that you keep it separate for the areas that need to be separate, but that you align for the areas that need to be aligned. And then crucially, Phil, the other piece is there will be learnings and benefits that you'll get from doing online really, really well that you can then apply into your face-to-face core machine. We've seen that really recently with student satisfaction and student success and how they can engage more deeply with their learners. We've seen it with, we do a pre-enrollment program on our degree programs called Thrive, where students get study skills, English language support, various other things. And one of our partners has then taken that back into their core machine, and we've been very happy to just build that for their face-to-face students. So making sure that you are different where you need to be different, and running a different machine where you need to be doing that, but then also aligning and driving towards where the university wants to be for 2035. I think both are important.
Got you. So on the surface, given this, I guess the simplistic understanding is the UK online market is 5 years, maybe 10 years behind the US market. So what we've seen in the US, maybe without all the politics, I don't know, because we've had huge politics around and regulatory efforts. But the UK, the best way to think of it is a 5 to 10 year delay in what you're going through. But could you describe uh, what part of that mental model works, and where is it different? How is the UK market different from the US?
Great question. So certainly in terms of the number of institutions that have major online suites, I'd say we're definitely, 5 years behind might be about right. Every university in the US, every major university in the US has a serious suite of online degree programs. That's not the case in the UK today. So there is definitely an evolution that's going on, which kind of fits into your model. I think where it's different in more complicated ways is in two respects. The first is that our student body is very, very different to the US student body. You will know the data better than me, Phil, but the last I saw was 84% of online students in the US are studying with the university within their state. I mean, that is an incredibly high number. And the 16%, by the way, the other 16%, they're overwhelmingly studying with the university within the United States, right? So
Yes.
these guys are doing very, very little international marketing recruitment activity. In the UK, that's fundamentally different. For most of our partners at Skilled, roughly anywhere between 40 and 50% of students will be domestic, but the majority are usually international.
The majority are.
Majority, absolutely, absolutely, because we're just not big enough as a country, right? Like we've got 70 million people with the size of Texas or whatever, and so you need to be international from day one.
Without the barbecue. But
Without
yeah.
exactly, well, yeah, without the barbecue and several other things, but it's like it's just different, and that's something I love about our system here. Like we are in 120, 130 markets for most of our partnerships pretty quickly, and that just creates a whole different set of challenges, opportunities, dynamics around geo-targeting, around channels, around pricing, around scholarships, around just how you really micro-target to find these students, because there are massive numbers of them. And the opportunity, I would say, for US universities right now is that you've got the demographic situation, you've got visa challenges, all of that kind of stuff. But there is a demand side which is saying, I want more US and UK degree programs. Please offer them up. And even from
More international demand for US and UK degree programs.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. I mean, these are students, and this is the other thing actually. The demand side has changed in the last 10 years. That's really worth digging into, actually, Phil. You're right, because that demand side has grown in wealth, has grown in ambition, has grown in its desire to stay, by the way, within its countries, because they've often got 6, 7, 8% growth rather than slightly more anemic growth, certainly in the UK. And so they want to stay in their country. They don't want the accommodation costs. They want to stay close to their kids, but they want to study with big global brands. They want to study with the top 1 or 2 markets in the world, but they can't travel. They can't leave their kids. They can't leave their job. And giving them the opportunity to work, earn, and learn is something that I feel we have a responsibility to do.
So part of this, so one way to look at it with your current company with Skilled is not so much that Skilled expertise is international student recruitment for online, and that's unique and that's your niche. It's to say, no, the UK market, that's what it's like. That's the environment that you came up in the past 5 years as a company, and well, obviously longer personally. But now that you know how to do that, and so now you're talking to U.S. universities to say, hey, you guys are starting to look at this international student recruitment in a different way. So to a certain degree, it sounds like you're making a bet as coming into the U.S. market. You're making a bet that in this case, the U.K. is 5 years ahead of the U.S. in the concept of international student recruitment. Is that accurate?
Undoubtedly. I mean, we've been doing international online recruitment for a lot longer than the US. US is, I'd say, fairly early on that journey. And we didn't intend to do this, by the way. We thought we would just keep serving UK universities for the next X number of years. But for the student population, they see us in a very similar way, right? They want to study with a kind of brand that is from the UK or US. And that's where the wonderful parallels between the US and UK are so beautiful, right? That's why I've
Yeah, they're
put,
going both ways.
yeah, exactly. But there's a prestige, right, that comes with studying and having a qualification from one of the top 1 or 2 markets in the world. And if you look at the demographics, actually, and I always look at this from the student perspective, by the way, rather than the university perspective. But if you look at the demographics on skilled programs, 94% of these students are in work whilst they're studying. 57% are female. The overwhelming majority are kind of, in these parts of the world that have just got amazing growth going on and some real kind of dynamics changing. And the average age is 37. So they are these amazing people who are looking for that master's degree, and are sitting there in the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, and they're saying, "Look, help me out here." And so, yeah, we've obviously announced our first partnership in the US, which it's going really well. It's a really beautiful relationship. We will announce one more, fairly shortly. But we've always been really clear. We only want to partner with the right institutions that want to do this well, who want to adapt their systems and processes and that kind of thing in the right
Well,
way.
let me check you on the U.S. on too, because you mentioned something about it wasn't your intention of going to the U.S. Quite often, when I talk to European EdTech companies that are coming to the U.S., if we're on, well, they are honest. It's a bigger financial market, larger number of customers, a lot more money that flows through. And so it's a deliberate strategy to come to the US. You're saying that wasn't the original plan. So take these two universities, you just announced the American University deal. Are they looking are they already convinced that they need international student bodies and they come looking and they talk to you, or are you evangelizing the concept with them? So who's approaching whom?
We have done zero proactive, kind of brand building, if you like, in the United States. There are wonderful people. I've got to give a shout out to Paul LeBlanc, for example, who, has been a wonderful friend and supporter for a long time. And there's various other people like that who've been, really wonderful kind of guides on this kind of thing. But we have really sought to serve British universities. That was the reason why we did this. And just to kind of take a step back for 2 seconds on that, Phil, the model that we have, right, and kind of offering up that choice of services, responsibilities, business models, that kind of stuff, it is less financially attractive, as you know well, than the revenue share model, right? Like the revenue share model, you do very, very well, right? Years 3 and 4 through to year 10. This is less attractive, right? I'm very open about that, very straightforward about that. My investor friends and people like that kind of kick me all the time. Why are you doing it in that way? It's the right thing to do, and the rest of it will figure itself out, but it's the right thing to do. And what then happens is you show that you can do it for these British universities, and the US guys are like, you know what, you can do this for brands, not dissimilar to mine. We now need to do this because of all the reasons we've chatted about briefly. And yeah, we don't, if you compare some of those partnerships, our US and UK partnerships, they're pretty much the same. The mechanics of them are the same. The kind of challenges that you run into are the same. The opportunities for just shaking up the product and the proposition are exactly the same. The concerns amongst academics are the same. It's beautiful to see so many similarities as well as nuances and differences in certain areas, but it's so similar. And I think that's a beautiful thing for us to celebrate, frankly. Like all of our universities are obviously different. They have their own unique quirks, their own USPs, and we have to bring that alive, to the postgrad online student. But, seeing the fact that, we can be so many miles apart, but still such beautiful, distinctive, quirky universities, that makes me super, super happy.
And it's interesting, and I'll just wrap up with this thought because, like I said, there's a simplistic model saying UK online is 5 years behind the US, but in reality, there are significant differences that we're talking about with international students. And particularly in that area, we have the reverse happening, where the UK is likely 5 to 10 years ahead of the US in this regard. So it's feeding back and forth. And I know, and then you make another great point that the UK and Australia, there's a lot of tie-ins between them. So this is, this gets back to why you're the executive producer of the podcast, not just the introduction, but it's hitting a lot of the same things. And the reason we wanted to do this is to look at multiple angles into online education. So this has been a fascinating conversation. Appreciate your time and talking about this fascinating subject. So thank you.
Real pleasure, Phil. Thanks for everything you do. It's a genuine pleasure to chat.
Welcome back, and I hope you enjoyed the interview. And so initial thoughts, anything that big takeaways that you guys had from the interview?
So I thought it was really interesting and a great first interview because there was lots that I disagreed with or that I had issues with. So it actually gives us something to argue about because I fear that we've become alike each other, which is very frightening. but there are definitely some areas where I like I think I disagree, and I feel guilty saying that because he obviously knows a lot more about the UK setting than I do. But certainly there's some issues there. For example, about the role of the pandemic, about sort of some of the timing, about how you break it down, those sorts of things. But certainly a great interview, and I want to second the recommendation for Martin Bean as the second interviewer.
Well, we're going to be seeing him in a month,
Yes.
month and a half. We maybe we should line that up while we're
Yeah.
together. So, but before we get Neil's thoughts, I want to check to see. Well, first of all, on the disagreements, part of what I liked is it was very much a good conversation with Rajay. It wasn't overly promotional. And we've all talked. That's one of the problems with interviews on podcasts these days, particularly education podcasts. But really, you get different perspectives. You get what he has to say. So I think that he would appreciate the conversation. For me, and see if you're talking the same thing, certainly in the US and I think in the UK, I saw the pandemic as a net positive for online education. And we've talked about that, how it's actually increased adoption and made it a greater opportunity to expand. Is that the element that you meant there?
Yeah, yeah. I certainly do see his point about how it could put people off because there was that emergency remote teaching, which could be mistaken for online learning, which was kind of less than optimal, but given the 2 week time frame, pretty darn awesome that people pulled it off. But I think overall, it really woke up people's perspective about what is possible for online learning. So I see it as a net positive as well. And even in the UK, because, for right into 2022, I was working at Gartner, so I was working with a lot of UK clients.
So, and you'll notice we now have language warnings on the podcast with darn. Neil, what were your takeaways from the interview?
My mother listens to this, so I'll be very careful.
Okay.
No, I think we can get into the pandemic point because I have I have probably a slightly different take on that as well. I think it was just interesting because I think it touched on a bunch of things that I think we've talked about before. I think although you didn't kind of get into it really explicitly, there was that kind of theme around an OPM or an online education company kind of unbundling services and that being the direction of travel, both in terms of the kind of necessity of what universities want. And I think that's always an interesting debate because, I think you tend to see certain companies kind of pushing that angle. And I think we've all expressed some reservation as that being the singular direction of travel. But I think it's an interesting thing to discuss relative to that and also relative to the kind of viability of OPMs. I think the other interesting thing was just the kind of discussion around whether you approach online education as I think you used the term kind of skunk works, Phil, you do it off to the side versus the kind of embedded into the institution. I think that's also an interesting discussion and debate, and I think that has nuance to it. And I think the last one, which I think is just relevant to both geographies really in terms of expanding and growing online education, is the kind of international online angle and what you do about that and the relative maturity and of our kind of respective nations, I think, on that front.
Yeah. The Skunkworks conversation was interesting to me. It actually caught me a little bit off guard, but I mean, that's what's good about an interview and getting different perspectives. Because, I mean, if you really look at some of the core value of an OPM, it is to get it away from the bureaucracy of universities that can't get out of their own way. That is one of the value propositions.
And I think it's a
Um,
huge value proposition that I think got lost a little bit in that conversation, in a way, in Rajay emphasizing expertise. But I see, I mean, I just in watching universities work with OPMs, it's that getting over inertia that is such a huge thing that the OPMs bring to the table.
well, that gets to the timeline thing because I see the point of you got to be careful of Skunkworks if you keep it long term, because then you have to ask, well, how is this benefiting the university? So there's sort of an idea of, well, it makes sense, not as a singular direction of travel, as you're saying, Neil, but to go with a skunkworks type of separated at the beginning, but over time, how do you benefit the larger institution? And I think that that issue of where in the life cycle of a university the models make sense and how they shift over time is something that we ought to discuss further. Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, funnily enough, I had a conversation today with someone who was essentially saying that they regretted not taking learnings from a previous OPM relationship. But I think my question around that orientation, perhaps from a company, is kind of what's in it for them to upskill a university? Does a university kind of have the bandwidth to be able to kind of explicitly take on the learnings through the partnership as well? And that's quite apart from whether you should or shouldn't look to embed or keep off to one side and ring fence. So I think again, it's I guess it's an interesting pitch and a proposition for a company coming into a university, and probably a little bit distinct in the market over here. But I don't think it's black and white, and that's not how I look at it.
The other thing that really struck me, as you can tell from the conversation, is sort of the time frame issue. Like, is the UK market like the US online market, just 5 to 10 years after the fact? And the point being made about international student recruitment for online programs, you actually have the reverse case, that the UK online market looks like it might be ahead of the US market, and we might see movement here. So you have this dynamic of which country is at which part of its evolution, and you sort of see both, particularly with the difference around international student recruitment. So that was one of the more interesting insights that I got from the interview.
Yeah, that was fascinating, but it's going to be hard to really compare because like the world is upside down now because of all the changes that are happening in the US and the UK and Australia and Canada around international students, but particularly the US right now. Um,
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, to be honest, the kind of more seasoned online education people over here have always kind of presented that juxtaposition with the US being a lot more domestic focused for online. And sometimes that's been relative to US companies coming over here, and maybe looking to international markets. But there's a good legacy of distance and online education over here internationally. You know, University of London, one of the oldest distance learning institutions. But then you have, you know, universities like Liverpool and Leicester and Manchester and Heriot-Watt have built up significant online international students in the past. Some of those have kind of reduced, some of those have kind of held steady. So I think he's right to say that there's been a stronger legacy of online international student recruitment over here, but there are still plenty of institutions over here that are way behind in that respect. And there are more complicated reasons that don't necessarily present themselves as to why those universities have done well internationally online. And I think that's a general area that there's not a lot of knowledge about. It's not simply due to institutions getting good at Google in India, or you know, it's more, there's more factors behind recruitment successes internationally than just digital marketing, say for example.
Just the need for it. And in other words, the argument that, hey, the UK is a lot smaller, we need to have a broader student population. His argument was more than that, but that it makes sense that the UK was stronger on this from the beginning. Did that resonate with you from what you've seen?
It resonates now. It definitely resonates now because I think it's universities are running out of headroom, so they're kind of looking for international. So it's definitely a much hotter topic now for the kind of obvious reasons. I think in general, and I'm not sure if this is a kind of a Commonwealth Empire legacy thing. I think in general, UK universities have probably been a bit more orientated internationally. So I would probably look to that than to the fact that we're a small nation and therefore we need to go international to make up the numbers. Or, he didn't say that, but I think it's more about our country's orientation and legacy than it is about I don't know. But then
so you might argue it's not really international. These are our locales across the world anyway, that you're recruiting from.
They would argue that it was international.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'm getting into dodgy territory here, but
we're not going to debate colonialism.
But I mean, if you look at the University of London, then there are relationships there that are built on the past, really. And this is a university that did distance learning. I think, was it 1870 something? I can't remember when they first did the first distance.
Yeah, it was like a shorthand course, wasn't it, or something of that nature?
Was it out? It might. I feel like it was in Mauritius or Sri Lanka. I can't remember. It was somewhere like that. Your University of London colleagues will tell me what the right thing is. But yeah, so that's definitely relates to that. But yeah, I think now online recruiting internationally for online is just increasingly important.
I don't want to break the flow of the conversation, but perhaps we could quickly just clarify that we're talking about a different kind of online recruitment than the sort of franchisee, Beacon Education, Emeritus, Stafford Global kind of thing.
Well, I think you're signing up to provide a pithy differentiation analysis.
And the reason why I sort of was part of the way into the interview is like, oh yeah, no, I was misunderstanding there. So for a while now, universities in the US and the UK have been doing this kind of education that Phil and I have struggled to come up with a pithy name for, but sort of more franchised, working with a third-party company to offer a degree completely in another country. So like an Emeritus or a Stafford Global or Beacon Education. This is just bringing international students into regular courses, online courses that are run. And so you'll have a mix of people from different countries in the courses, a regular one.
Yeah, I mean that's one flavor of it, but I think it kind of goes back to a point I made earlier, in that when you look at some of the institutions over here that have decent numbers of online international students, it's not exclusively, but there are factors like what you referred to, Morgan, that there's online programs being offered as franchise provision through specific providers in countries. There's relationships with organizations that you mentioned, like Stafford Global. There's other kind of relationships. So one university, I think, has a relationship with a training center that's in a particular locality. So that's what I was getting at when I was saying the factors behind online international recruitment aren't just simply going to the open market internationally to recruit. There are often a range of different factors that aren't apparent behind some
so
of them.
So it's really a mix of things.
Yeah, I don't think that's what the proposition that Rajay is putting forward. But there are often, when you think about the legacy of UK universities and some of those that have strengths, there are reasons behind that, and some of those reasons are kind of in-country presence and operations. They're not simply how we've got really good at marketing online degrees in Singapore, say, for example.
So one final aspect I would add to this that was interesting is, and keeping in mind this was an interview with Rajay, not necessarily an interview with the CEO of Skilled Education. However, there is the aspect that they've established themselves in the UK and they're entering the US market. And so it's not just time frame of who's doing things first. There's also what this happens with EdTech providers and OPM providers going each direction. It is more common of US providers being seen as going into other countries. But you have to say Pearson, UK company, when they bought Embanet and created their OPM business, that was sort of the reverse case as well. A British company, even though it was run out of the US, it was owned by Pearson. But on the pure EdTech outside of the OPM space, you don't see a whole lot of this. You got some AI companies out of Scandinavia that have had an impact here in the US, but it also just introduced the countries crossing the Atlantic in both directions angle for it, which I found interesting. So it'll be worth tracking how skilled education does with this move.
Yeah, and I think the couple of things that we've already mentioned feel to me like they speak well to what I see and hear from a distance of a US market around that kind of sense of unbundling being more desirable. Whether it's more viable is kind of another question, and desirable across the piece, and the online international students. So I think there's kind of a couple of points that resonated probably with some of the discussions that are happening in the US, perhaps.
We're not shifting to an interview format, but I do have to say it's interesting to be able to allow us to listen, learn from an outside perspective, and comment on it. So thanks for this episode. Thank you, Rajay, for the interview. And we'll be back with you after this episode to talk again about the LMS and VLE market.